Hello and welcome to another edition of That Catholic Saints Guy. I'm your host, Brian O'Neill, and today we're going to talk about a remarkable convert to the Catholic faith from the Church of England. Blessed, or rather, the servant of God, Ignatius Spencer. Born to one of the most famous families of English nobility and a great Catholic mind in his own right. And joining me today is Father Ben Lodge, the vice postulator for the cause of Blessed Dominic Barberi, who we've already discussed, and the postulator for the cause of the servant of God, Ignatius Spencer. Father, welcome. How are you today?
Thank you. Fine.
Good, good. So last time we talked about Blessed Dominic, the incredible impact he made on the church in England. We discussed how he was, how John Henry Newman was a footnote in his life, but really Blessed Dominic was a major part of St. John Henry's conversion. And with St. John Henry's conversion came tens of thousands of conversions. So a huge, huge impact there. Today, though, we're going to discuss another Englishman, another countryman of yours, who is just an extraordinary force of nature, based on the research that I've done on him. And what can you tell us about Venerable, or well, hopefully soon to be Venerable, Ignatius Spencer?
Okay, Brian, let's get the decks clear. First of all, he was actually born George, but for the sake of avoiding confusion, we'll stick to calling him Ignatius all the way through. And the other thing that I have to make very clear, because I do deal with journalists from various media, is if Ignatius is canonized, it will be because of who he is, not because of who his descendants are. The journalists, I'm afraid, jump on the fact, well, wasn't he the great-great-uncle of Lady Diana? Yes, he was. And Rome said, well, doesn't that mean he'll be connected to the future King of England? Yes, it does. And if you actually just go to Google Images and look at his picture, you will be amazed at how similar he looks to Sir Winston Churchill.
Yes.
Because it's the same family. And of course, Churchill's full name was Winston Spencer Churchill, as in Ignatius Spencer. So as long as that's understood, are you okay with that, Brian?
Well, I think we can proceed.
We're not going to confuse. Right. Ignatius was born in Admiralty House in 1799. And he was born there because his father was the first Lord of the Admiralty. In American terminology, it would be like your Minister for Defense or in charge of the armed forces. So Ignatius was born there, and many Americans who've been to London will have walked past it as you go down from Trafalgar Square towards the Houses of Parliament, passing Downing Street on the right. Just before that, you come to Horse Guards Parade. And it was off Horse Guards Parade that Ignatius was born. So he was the youngest of 8 children, and he was born into one of the wealthiest families in Britain. So they owned Spencer House. Spencer House was the most spectacular house in London. And it was after it had been completed that eventually Buckingham Palace was done up, but they never got to the same standard. Buckingham Palace is literally across the lawn from Spencer House. So very, very close connections to the royal family. They had an out-of-town house down at Wimbledon. Many of your viewers would know Wimbledon because of the Lawn Tennis Association and the tennis, and the finals. All of that was where the Spencers had a house. They had a house up in Althorp, where, of course, I have to say it because otherwise they'll shout me down, where Lady Diana is buried. That was the main country house. They had a house out towards Norfolk, more used as a sort of shooting base. They owned 3 London boroughs. I was trying to think out how to convey that to Americans, and it would be like owning Manhattan and Queens and somewhere else. So,
So they were paupers. They lived in abject poverty.
Yeah, I mean, within the house in Althorp, when Ignatius was there on his own, there were 80 people minimum working inside the house. There were something like 140 people working in the gardens. They made their money over 300 years, basically, primarily from raising sheep and cattle. They were very good at it. They had good land, and it was shrewd investments. So that they were very, very wealthy. And this is important because eventually it's this wealth that Ignatius gives up. A phenomenal wealth. He had nothing to worry about. So, as I say, he was the youngest of 8, and he was eventually went to Eton College, where even today the royal family go. Many royals from the Middle East go there. And while he was there, he was actually in the care of an Anglican clergyman. That was quite normal. Eventually, he goes to Cambridge to do his degree. In those days, 2 years was the normal period for a member of the nobility to do it. So he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, and he felt that it was some of the happiest times of his life because he felt he'd been badly bullied at Eton. He'd lived a very sheltered life. It was a very traditional Church of England. I'd be slow to use Anglican because they wouldn't have been that high, but they would have prayers read every Sunday night, and often a long sermon would be read by one of the men in the family. So there was a very strong sort of religious upbringing. There's all sorts of explanations as to why that was so strong. It wasn't peculiar to them, but the nobility were worried. We're talking 1799 when he's born. 10 years earlier, we had the French Revolution, and that meant huge instability in France. The nobility collapsed. And so the aristocracy in England was saying, hang on, we could face a similar problem. And so there was almost a turning back to God. And so that's part of the explanation. It's a bit more complicated, but anyway, so Ignatius goes to Cambridge, to Trinity College in Cambridge, and he thoroughly enjoys himself. Now, he kept a diary from about 10 days before he entered Cambridge. And most of his life has been kept in the diary. There's a 12-year gap, which is unfortunate. And that's how we know so much about his life. I, for about 9 years, transcribed his diary and then his letters. And I just had to have, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to make this out. This is the diary.
Oh my. That's amazing. He doesn't have the, am I correct? Maybe not the neatest penmanship.
It's because when he was writing initially,
Yes.
he was writing with a quill. And he describes how when he was on holiday in North Wales, he'd forgotten his writing gear. And so he went out and he shot a seagull. And he says, it is with a feather from the seagull I am writing this. But he kept a very detailed diary. And I actually took the diary to the British Library for help.
Yeah, okay.
How could we read it? And we suggested photocopying and enlarging. And they said, absolutely not, because you destroyed the source material because of the light. You could probably do it now with cameras, but I didn't tell them I'd already tried it, and I enlarged it by 5%. The distortion was so great, it was actually worse. So I just would spend an hour every night with a big magnifying glass. So that's how we ended up getting the diaries.
Wow.
Anyway, to go back, he started the diaries, and in the early times in Cambridge, he would write who came for breakfast. Now, this wasn't a light breakfast. Often as not, it could be quite a substantial meal, because for the Victorians, breakfast was a very big meal. So he'd write who came, and then he would describe what lectures he went to. And then he would maybe describe he played tennis. His great mania was playing cricket. It's one of the few things he felt really grateful to his mother for. She tried to get him to do various things, including to develop as a dancer, to become a guitarist. And all of these failed miserably. He regretted it later, but his one love was cricket. He describes it as a mania. And he actually got into trouble because they also had a house down on the Isle of Wight, right beside where Queen Victoria lived, at Osborne House. And when they went down there, they'd take a whole load of the servants, but Ignatius would grab the servants and take them out and make them play cricket in order to get a game in. So that caused trouble in the family from time to time. But he kept with his mania for cricket, even years later as a Catholic priest, when he was the spiritual director in the seminary. He not only taught the students about spirituality and prayer, he also taught them the finer arts of cricket. So if he is eventually made a saint, I'm assuming that certainly the English team would adopt him as a patron saint for cricketers.
It reminds me of that. It reminds me of that song by 10cc, Dreadlock Holiday, where the guy says, I don't like cricket, I love it. And
oh, well, as I say, the word he used in the diary twice is his mania. Really? His mania. You know, so he spends his time in Trinity, Cambridge. He attends Anglican services, as was expected of him. Often he would say he didn't take the sacrament because he hadn't been given enough notice to prepare. Oh. And he's also, it's one of the few things where there's a negative note about him. He's quite critical of the sermons that are preached. He doesn't explain why, he just says they're badly delivered or bad content. As the youngest son, it was just automatically assumed he would become an Anglican clergyman. Because of the family, it was basically taken as read that once he was ordained, he'd do a couple of years as an Anglican clergyman, and automatically he would be appointed a bishop in the Church of England. It just went with the territory, went with the family. So that was the expectation. So towards the end of his time in Cambridge, he said, I think I better do a couple of lectures in theology. Now, all he had to do was appear, and they kept count of the number of lectures. And if he did something like 14 lectures attended, that was it. That was sufficient for ordination. Yes, I think it does raise eyebrows today when you explain this.
There's a shameless plug alert in my book, 150 North American Martyrs You Should Know. I write about a guy named Father Pedro Martinez, one of the first martyrs on American shores. And he had been ordained a Jesuit priest, and he demanded that his superiors send him back to seminary, because they said, no, it's not a problem. You don't have to worry about it. And he says, look, if I go to hell because I mislead someone, because I have bad formation and bad theology, are you going to come there? Are you guys going to support me then? In other words, I have this responsibility. So to hear this, it's remarkable for the modern era. I mean, when we consider what theology formation is, but that was the way it was for centuries. Even in the Catholic Church, you didn't have to have much formation to receive ordination.
No, but with the Passionists, they became aware of how well-educated men like Newman and the Oxford men were. This is why people like Dominic Barbary studied Greek, so that he actually wrote to them in Greek from time to time and carried on discussions. So he was no idiot. But by the time of Ignatius preparing the Catholic Church, I mean, 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act took place, by which Catholics could freely and openly practice their religion, and they could take most jobs, even within the army or the civil service. But there was no Catholic schools. So catechetics was an important element.
We should,
so there were many.
I'm sorry, we should pause here for a second, because American viewers, while they may have an awareness that the Catholic Church was persecuted and that there was a huge prejudice that exists even today, as we have seen recently with the confirmation of some judicial appointments to our federal benches. There was that terrible prejudice, but ever since the founding of the country, ever since 1791 and the ratification of the Bill of Rights, we have had the ability to freely practice our religion here. Whereas in England, from the time of Queen Elizabeth, well, actually since the time of
the Reformation, basically.
The Reformation, yeah, up until 1829, as you've noted, Catholics they had to be basically underground. And tell me if I'm misstating this.
No, the practice of their religion, basically, it was very hard. There was active persecution of the clergy. This is how we had so many martyrs, priests trained over in Europe, and then they'd come over and within 2 or 3 years, maybe be denounced and hanged, drawn, and quartered. So there was a long tradition of that. And it wasn't always as dramatic. They stopped, obviously, they were stopping Catholics owning land. And if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. And I mean, that was the case in Northern Ireland, right through up to the 1960s. That's what led to a lot of the trouble over there. So yeah, there was a strong history of anti-Catholicism, which Dominic encountered when he arrived. He was shocked to A, find them burning effigies of the Pope, and B, when he walked through Stone, literally getting stoned by young boys throwing mud and stones and horse muck at him. So yeah, it was a very anti-Catholic situation. So Ignatius met a man called Father John Fletcher, and John Fletcher seems to have been an extremely talented man at producing what today we'd call catechetical instructions. And Ignatius met him, first Catholic priest that he met, and they seem to have got on very well. And by this stage, like Newman, Ignatius was beginning to say, well, where do we get our teaching from? And they dropped back to the 39 Articles of the Church of England.
And that's the 39 Articles. That is the
founding document.
Right. And if you're an Anglican clergyman, you have to subscribe at least
Precisely.
To every single one of those. You can't say, at least not officially,
I'll take the first 8 and the last 3 and ignore the rest.
Exactly.
He signed an oath that he took the lot. And what had happened with both, it's fascinating the way, when they hadn't met, Newman and Ignatius in parallel went back and they looked at this and they said, well, what's the origin of the 39 Articles? So when they started, they'd find certain things, obviously, in the Gospels. But then they both realized that, well, some of the stuff in the 39 Articles isn't there. And the one for Ignatius was about the Trinity. He was looking for basically Jesus saying, well, there's the Father, the Spirit, and there's me. That's the three of us, and you got to believe that. He said, but there's no proof of the Trinity. So he was very concerned about this. And when he discussed it with other Anglican clergymen, he got a different answer from each one. I remember when I lived in Sweden, asking some Lutherans what they believed in terms of the Eucharist. And the first one says, it's purely a commemorative act 2,000 years ago. The next one said, I believe the full Roman position. This is the body and blood of Jesus Christ, no problem. The next one said, it depends on the individual faith of each person. Yeah, and so you could go around, so you could get 8 answers all to this. And Ignatius was saying, well, which one is it? So it provoked a sort of crisis for him. And then when he started to meet the Catholics, he noticed they all gave the same answer. They said, well, there's something going on here. And it was at that point he was introduced to the word tradition. The trouble today is when you say that, especially many Catholics, they think it's, well, what we used to do before pre-Vatican II days.
Custom,
No,
yeah.
the tradition is that which is handed on by word of mouth. And it was explained to him, look, you don't think that the apostles just stood up and said, what's there? They would have explained it. But it's the faithful who then keep check on it. And they say, well, no, hang on, that's not what Paul meant. And that it was the group, the sense of the faithful that was so important. So both Newman and Ignatius thought that they'd really hit the gold dust when they came across this. So they recognized there was, yes, the scriptures, but there was also tradition. And the church today is built on those 2 main streams. So, I mean, this wasn't a quick 1-hour discussion. It went on and he struggled with it and he had angst. And in the end, he got 3 extraordinary letters, massively long letters. And they were apparently, from a gentleman in Lille in France. And basically it says, I understand you're having problems. I also am having problems. Can you explain all of this about the position of the Catholic faith? It's the most extraordinary thing. It's a very, very long process of reading all 3 letters. Later, Ignatius found out that it wasn't a man, it was a woman who'd written it. So the question was, well, why the subterfuge? One possible explanation is he didn't want to be seen, or she didn't want to be seen as a woman persuading an Anglican clergyman to leave the Anglican Church. I don't know, there's a lot of speculation about it. Eventually, we found out that he discovered shortly before she died, he never met her, never made contact with her, except by letter, that she had entered a novitiate of the Sacred Heart Sisters in Paris, where she died. So there's all sorts of questions about her life and so on. But that episode with the 3 letters was, because it was so cogently argued, really convinced him. Then he met a young man called Ambrose de Lille. Ambrose had converted at the age of 16. And when Ignatius met him, he couldn't believe how talented Ambrose was in answering questions. And they became good friends. And Ambrose invited him to go up to his manor up in Leicestershire. And he said, come up. He said, I'm having a couple of bishops and archbishops round and we can have a discussion. So cutting a long story short, they turned up. Ignatius was going basically because he was curious. He had no intentions of anything more than that. And when he arrived, Ambrose, the young Catholic convert, was taking on some of the most brilliant Anglican bishops in the country and beating them every time. So in the end, Ignatius is taken over to meet a Dutch Dominican in Leicester by Ambrose, and they have a couple of talks, and Ignatius still has no idea he's so close to converting. In the end, the step is taken, and on the 30th of January 1830, Ignatius was received into the church. But that immediately provoked a problem. If he wrote and told his father, the shock could kill the father. So he thinks, whoa, this is a problem, because he wasn't just giving up being an Anglican, he was giving up his Anglican living. I mean, he'd become the parish priest of several villages on the Althorp estate. And this was going to be a huge, huge issue. So he stopped with the Dominican, Father Kestrick. And every morning, he'd start asking the Dominican questions about the faith. And in the end, Father Kestrick was well able for him, but I think he just got fed up. And his answer became, because that's how it is, because the church says so. Just believe it. You know, you can't spend your life asking questions all the time. You got to grab the faith and get on with it. Well, of course, this did provoke another problem in that his father realized, oh my Lord, if Ignatius comes back and starts going around the villages, he's going to upset the people, saying that they're all heretics and they should all become Roman. So because the father was so well connected, he gets in touch with an English bishop, local, and says, we don't want him going around the country as an itinerant. Can you do anything about it? So they agree to send him to Rome to do his studies for the priesthood. So he's quickly sent to Rome, and he arrives in the Venerable English College where Nicholas Wiseman was the rector, the superior. Wiseman was about 4 years younger than Ignatius, and they got on very well. But of course, Ignatius was desperate to get back to England, to convert all of England. This was his vocation, this was his mission. And even though he was good friends with Wiseman, he tore into him one day and said, for crying out loud, will you stop studying these Syrian manuscripts and treatises on geology and start preparing yourself for the English mission? Now, as that turned out, it was good advice, because eventually Wiseman did go back to England, first to Oscott College, the seminary, and then he ended up as the cardinal of all England. So Ignatius was ordained, and he hoped then to go and spend a couple of months with Dominic Barbary, who had been appointed the superior of a retreat in Lucca. As it happened, because of the dire shortage of priests, Ignatius was told, get straight back to England. But Dominic noted that he was ordained in the Church of St. Gregory, which is literally a couple of 100 meters down the road from St. John and Paul. Yeah. And it was from there that Augustine was sent to England as the first missionary.
Augustine of Canterbury, correct?
Of Canterbury. So there were all sorts of coincidences. And the first mass that Ignatius said was on the feast of Bede the Venerable, was the great English historian, that they had special permission, because normally you couldn't say a mass except on a particular feast day. But in Ignatius' case, they allowed him to say mass on what would have been in England the feast of Bede the Venerable. So it was really quite an interesting set of coincidences.
And we should mention the fact that San Gregorio Magno, or St. Gregory the Great Church, is the national, in Rome, every nationality has a national church, kind of its epicenter. It used to be, for the Americans, it used to be Santa Susana, now it's San Patricio. And for the British, it was St. Gregory the Great, San Gregorio. And just up the road is Santi Giovanni e Paolo, which Saints John and Paul built over their house where they were martyred, and it is the main church for the Passionists.
Yeah, it's our mother house.
Yeah, I've been inside the convent. I've been to the chapel where St. Paul of the Cross is buried. It's bigger than most churches. It's a huge chapel. But in any event, it's just the fact that this coincidence, I didn't realize it. So thank you for bringing it to the to our attention.
Literally, if you come out of the front door of St. John and Paul's, you know, you wouldn't need to be drunk, but you can roll down the hill and you'll bump into St. Gregory's. Yeah, it's right on the doorstep.
That's a great point.
Anyway, so he was ordained and he was able to spend a very short period with Dominic. And of course, he rekindled Dominic's enthusiasm for the conversion of England. Dominic then said, well, you go and get things ready and hopefully I'll follow very shortly. So Ignatius goes back to England, and initially he was appointed as, I guess we'd call them a curate, or what do you call them, an assistant pastor in a place called Walsall. Walsall is in the center of what was called the Black Country. It's got nothing to do with racism, I hasten to add. It was called black because of the amount of soot from the chimneys. Is the heart of the Industrial Revolution. So it took in Walsall, Dudley, West Bromwich, Tipton, Wolverhampton, a whole string of places, all going along in a sort of line. And you had blast furnaces, tanneries. It was absolutely horrendous. Ignatius was still getting money from the family. We're talking then about £3,000 a year as an allowance. Now, even though he had become a Catholic, the father continued to honor this donation to him each year. With the money, Ignatius started to build other churches. So he built one in West Bromwich, it's just north of Birmingham. And then he put money into Dudley, into the church in Tipton. But he was never happy because he didn't want this. He wanted to live a life of poverty. In some ways, he didn't have much of a choice because he was working primarily with the Irish who'd come to work in the industries of the Industrial Revolution. They were building canals, building railways, the navvies as they became known. Ignatius would get up very early, pray, maybe say mass, and then he'd go off maybe with a bottle of wine and some bread and be out for maybe 12, 14 hours. And all he'd have maybe would be, say, some water. He'd give everything else away. And there's a very interesting letter from him to his father. He used to write about every 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to the father. And he said, my time hunting rabbits on the Althorp estate has not been wasted. And I thought, well, what's this? And he explains that the Irish, that they were homeless, they were digging tunnels into what we would call slag heaps. It's the waste that comes out from the blast furnace, like coke and that, and they'd build a tunnel and they would live in there. So he said he spent his days hunting out the Irish in these tunnels. And he saw it as similar to hunting rabbits, shooting them on the Althorp estate. So he was, he knew what poverty was. But all the time he wanted to develop this. He said, we can all be perfect. It's not the private domain of monks or priests. So we've got this seed germinating when he wants to develop basically what we call the evangelical counsels. He wanted to live poverty, chastity, and obedience under vow. Now, obviously, as a Catholic priest, he was already under vow with chastity, but it was the poverty and the obedience that was the problem. He didn't see too much of a problem with obedience because he would simply do whatever the bishop told him. Poverty was a problem with this £3,000 a year coming in. So what he did, he gave it to the bishop and said to the bishop, you use it. But he said, I would advise you to just use it on big projects and get rid of it. And what was behind that, I believe, was he knew that every priest in the country, if they found out the bishop had a couple of £100 spare, oh, now your grace, I could be doing with that to fix the hole in my roof, you know? So the money came and the money went. So all the time, he's beginning to wonder about religious life. He'd done a couple of retreats with a Jesuit, even while he was still a student in Rome. And the Jesuit, the first time, said, no, he says, you shouldn't become a religious because in England, they need men to run the parishes. Don't forget, there were no parish structures. We didn't have a hierarchy of bishops until 1850. So parishes could only legally be established after 1829. So there was a lot of change. It's very difficult to imagine. But there was a huge boom then in building churches. And of course, Ignatius, because of his celebrity status, was always being invited to go and preach at these openings of churches. His friend Ambrose Phillips, he at one point promised to give land to the Passionists if they would come and live on his estate. But Ambrose got distracted by various things. In the end, he brought the Cistercians over and built the Abbey at Mount St. Bernard Abbey, which is still going strong today. But interestingly, Ignatius was asked to preach at its opening. Now, I found the full sermon, and I read it through about 3 times against the clock. And I discovered he could not have delivered the sermon in under an hour and 10 minutes. So now whenever I preach on Ignatius, I warn the people and hope that they brought their own pillows and cushions to sit on, because it's going to be an awful long homily. So anyway, he spent a lot of time going around all over the country preaching, especially for the opening of churches. One of the things that happened while he was in Rome, along with Wiseman, he went down ill. And all the clues are it was consumption, TB, tuberculosis. But both of them recovered. And one of the classic signs is people spit blood. So then when he was in West Bromwich, I mean, he was building up other churches, Dudley, Tipton, at an amazing rate. He developed another dose of tuberculosis. He wrote to Wiseman, our old friend has returned, meaning TB. So in the end, it was decided that he was really overdoing the work. And so they decided to pull him out of parish ministry, and they moved him to Oscott, which was the seminary for basically the north of England. And he was to go as spiritual director. Now, Oscott had just been occupied. They'd moved from Old Oscott, and that was handed over to Newman and his followers. So that was the first, these were not oratorians at the time. So there was a whole thing going on there in the background. So Ignatius...
And we should mention that the fact that the oratorians are the congregation of the oratory. It's the religious order founded by St. John Henry Newman.
No, by Philip Neri.
Oh, Philip Neri, sorry. Right, my bad. Yeah,
Newman,
because, right.
Yeah, no, you're right. He founded them in England. He brought them over and established them. So Ignatius had moved into Oscott, and interestingly, the historian in Oscott said, you do, of course, realize that it was Spencer's money that paid for all the side of the house. It's a huge house. You know, if you go onto Google Images, you'll find pictures of Oscott Seminary. That was Freudian, wasn't it? So it was while he was there as spiritual director, he would also teach the boys the finer arts of cricket. One of the men who was there described how Ignatius would come round late at night to the dormitories and just sit on the bed and spend an hour talking to them about how they needed to be enthusiastic for the conversion of England. This was the big thing. Everything was now geared to the conversion of England.
And we should talk about, I mean, I read, so I either want to be dispelled or confirmed that he was able to obtain an audience with then Princess Victoria while her uncle or William.
All I say is don't believe everything you read on Google.
Okay, so this gives me the opportunity to get clarification then. What I had read was that he had this audience and he basically said, convert to the Catholic faith. Is this true?
No, there is no evidence. What he did do, his sister was the lady in waiting, first to Queen Victoria, and then she was appointed the nanny to the children. Ignatius would arrange to go and visit her. She preferred him to visit at Windsor Castle, but she didn't want him coming into the castle in his habits, but rather to go and meet her in the mews. But on one occasion he was in the castle and he said he looked through the door and there were the children, Victoria's children. Now, interesting, because we talk about social media today and protecting people's privacy. Victoria had a very strong sense of not allowing the public to see the children. And so Ignatius admitted to his sister that coming down the passageway, he'd seen the children. But that is all. That now that Victoria does say at one point that she was in a room with him, but there's no evidence that I've been able to find of them actually having a conversation, and certainly nothing as direct as, you know, you should become a Roman Catholic.
Okay.
So yes, he was there. Yes, he had contact. And when eventually his sister resigned or retired, a number of the royal family were very, very upset because they said she was one of the most humane people in the royal household. So yeah, there are connections. Because he was in Oscar, obviously they followed academic timetables. So it meant that he would get a break in the summer. And so he decided in July 1842 to go over to Ireland. One of the big myths about Ireland is that they had a potato famine in 1845. They had one in 1843, 1841, 1839, 1836. They had dozens of potato famines. And those famines were also in Scotland, in the west of Scotland. So the people are poverty stricken. Now we get into a very contentious area here. By 1845, the famine was rampant. It's been argued that the 1 million deaths that took place in Ireland need not have happened. And then, of course, as you know, probably 1 million went to America, Australia, and England. So the whole country was decimated. We think we've got problems with this COVID pandemic, you know. We're not touching it in comparison to what happened there. Very interesting. I came across one, and it was a serious study in which it was suggested that the potato blight actually originated in America.
Really?
So we knew we had to blame you for something. And anyway, I don't know the origins of that. But what is disturbing about the whole thing is, while the Irish were starving to death because they lived on the potato, they were also growing wheat and barley. This was being harvested and taken by the British Army and taken under armed escort and shipped to Bristol in order to support the British Army. So in other words, the Irish were being starved of wheat and barley. Now later, Ignatius writes to his nephew. His nephew was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, which meant, in effect, he was in Ireland in the place of the Queen. And Ignatius says, in effect, this is a terrible famine. it's terrible that this isn't being sorted out. And the nephew writes back, yes, it is terrible, but it's only by famine that we can subjugate the Irish. In other words, this is a program of what today we would call ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing. You know, it's not something that developed after the Second World War.
No.
It was a policy. And it was to crush the Catholics, crush the Irish, subjugate them. Remember, this is long before Ulster has been created as a separate part of the United Kingdom. It all came under the British Crown. So it's an absolute horrendous situation. Now, it's into that situation, you need to understand that Ignatius goes to beg for money. I mean, this is where he could misjudge it quite badly. He went to beg for money to build churches in England. Now, initially, when he wrote to the bishops for permission, they said no. So he changed why he went, and he begged to pray, the Irish were to pray for prayers for England. And he said, and this was the clever part of Ignatius, he said, you've got to pray for your enemies. Jesus said, pray for your enemies and your prayers will be answered. Because if you pray for England and its conversion, God will listen and God will respond. You know, it was a very interesting argument. So while he knew he couldn't get money, he would beg for prayers. So that was his first preaching tour. He spent 6 weeks, and just reading the diary, it is exhausting. I mean, the distances he traveled, and all of this, you know, in a poverty-stricken country, no option of using railways or anything like that. So it was the most extraordinary thing. But he's still struggling with this idea of living according to religious vows. Eventually, he goes off and he makes another retreat under the Jesuits in England. And he ends up saying, well, I know the Rosminians. I could join them. He knew a bit about the Redemptorists. So he considers various things. And he lists this in the diary. But interestingly, he doesn't mention the Passionists, who of course he knew, A, because of Ambrose Phillips, and more importantly, because of Dominic Barbary. So the next day, he suddenly thinks, what's all this about? I just need to join the Passionists. So from there on, he experiences peace. That uncertainty, that questioning is finished. This is it. Now, I need to put in here, Ignatius never, as far as we know, and he never recorded, ever received any sort of visions.
Okay.
And he actually comments on this at one point saying, you know, it's easy for anybody dealing with my life. And I'm thinking, thank you, Ignatius. No visions, no danger of mystical misinterpretation or anything like that, which is a problem with Dominic. So he then writes to Father Dominic, as he was, and says, I'm going to join. And just on his birthday, when he's 46 years old, he enters the Passionists. Oh, he's 47. So he enters the Passionist novitiate. And remember that this is the man who had lived in one of the wealthiest houses in Britain. And the rule had said, the Passionist rule said, if anybody comes from a good family and a wealthy family, then the novice master should be extra hard on him. And in fact, the novice master took that quite literally. And some of the community felt he was overly harsh. So one of the things is he made Ignatius scrub a steel staircase. Ignatius had never touched a scrubbing brush in his life. And of course, it would never be done right. That was the nature of a novice master, constantly to find faults. I can't say that about my own novice master, who's still alive at 94 and living here with me at the moment. But it was a tough novitiate. But there was a peculiar element within it. Ignatius entered the Passionists as an ordained Catholic priest, not as most people entering the novitiate as a lay cleric studying for the priesthood. Because of the demands for priests, Ignatius had to go out and work in the workhouse in Stone, and that was predominantly occupied by the Irish, riddled with typhus, cholera, TB. And so he would go down day after day and work there in the workhouse. Inevitably, he caught, it's not clear, but it could well have been typhus, it could have been cholera. And so he comes back and he's on his deathbed. Doctors are called in, they say, you've got to give him the last rites and he will be dead within 2 hours. The community got the local people who by this stage were really loving the Passionists to start a novena, and they started and they prayed really hard, and eventually he recovered. He writes a very interesting account of the illness and how his brother, who had been quite hostile because he'd become a Catholic, sent money to pay for the doctors. So eventually he makes a good recovery, and a year later in 1848, at the knees of Father Dominic, he takes his vows as a Passionist. Well, he's not given any time to relax. He's sent out preaching missions immediately. And in effect, he starts on a massive tour of Ireland, preaching missions. The normal Passionist mission would be 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a week visiting people, saying the mission's starting, you will be coming. And then there's the opportunity for confessions, reconciliation, and preaching and teaching. Ignatius didn't have time to do all of that. So he developed a 3-day mission. So he'd arrive in the first town, maybe in the evening, start confessions, maybe preach. Next day, confessions, mass, instruction, confessions, more instruction, more confessions, more preaching, more confessions. He'd often spend 14, 16 hours a day in the confession, and sometimes have to send people home. I mean, there is a very interesting story of one woman, this was in England, who decided she needed to go to confession. And it's very rare you came across any incident of Ignatius losing his temper, but he could see her pushing her way forward. And it would appear that when she got close and up to him, he pulled the hat off her head and threw it right to the back of the crowd, forcing her to go to the back of the queue again. So I just thought that was a very humane thing. And interestingly, the devil's advocate, as he was called, hasn't picked up on that one. So,
well, what strikes me listening to this is I've been a member of some parishes where during the half hour on a Saturday afternoon, the middle of a Saturday afternoon, when confession is offered, you could throw a stone in any direction and not have, the only thing you might break is a statue or a piece of stained glass that you would hit rather, or the walls. And so to hear that he's kept constantly busy for 14 to 16 hours a day, hearing people's confessions, it gives you a sense of what the faith was like amongst the faithful, the people of God.
I mean, there could be 3 Passionists on a mission throughout England, and that was normal.
Really?
That was normal.
Wow.
14, 16 hours a day.
Wow.
And one of the things that the Passionists did, of course, originally they were Italian in origin, and they brought over certain Italian customs.
Okay.
When the Passionists preached, if they were in a church, they often didn't preach from the pulpit because they felt it was too restrictive. So they'd put boards out basically on top of the pews. So they had like a stage, a platform. And then they'd erect a huge mission cross. So they could walk around and, you know, a bit like, you know, in a studio today, how you could walk up an aisle and talk to the people. So they were good. They were good communicators. They could do the visual prompts and so on. They'd come in and they'd wear a mantle instead of a coat, and they'd swing it down in a loop and put it down beside the cross. And they think, right, the message was, right, we're going to do some work now, spiritual workouts. And then they'd start preaching. And often while that was going on, the other two would be in hearing confessions. And it was just relentless. But one of the things they were asked to do on these missions was not just preach, but to show the people. So sometimes they would do a meditation on the Passion out loud so that people could see how it was done. They didn't have books, they didn't have videos, they didn't have YouTube and all of that stuff. They had to be shown how to do this stuff. And then they'd be taken through an examination of conscience. And then they were asked to own up to their own faults. It was like public confession. And of course, there was a problem because nobody knew any faults that Ignatius had committed. And in the end, he ended up confessing out loud. Well, sometimes it gets very hot in the confessional, and I think I've dozed off a few times. Well, you know,
you abject sinner, you.
they probably stopped for toilet breaks, but it would be, well, I better get a move on because the queue's not getting any shorter. So that whole thing was a massive, massive issue. So the diary records how, you know, arrive on day 1, preach, confessions. Day 2, mass, preach, catechetics, confessions. Day 3, the same. If he was lucky, he'd get on the back of a cart and go down to the next village, start again. There are 6 months without even a half day off where he's doing this. It's relentless. And interestingly, he didn't have a very strong voice. Like Dominic, they weren't great preachers, but it was often the way they said it that really sort of spoke to people. So increasingly, his apostolate in Ireland would be trying to get money to support the building of places in England, trying to get vocations. On that, it should be commented that Ignatius was not a good judge of character. So, and at the same time, Mother Elizabeth Prout was trying to establish the Sisters of the Cross and Passion, as they became known. And so they worked together. And so he was looking for girls to join them. But Ignatius, on one occasion, sent 2 boys back from Ireland to Father Dominic in Stone to begin the novitiate. And a week later, when Ignatius turns up, he says, "Where are the 2 Irish lads I sent?" Dominic said, "Well, I've sent them away. They were no good." "Well, what was wrong?" "Well, one of them spent too much time in front of the mirror, combing his hair. That was no good for a Passionist."
Yeah.
So they had a lot of people come, but they had a lot more people go. And when the communities were supported by young priests coming from Italy, a lot of them died, partly from malnutrition. They were living a very, very strict diet, often starvation. But even the rule, because it was Italian, was a problem. Dominic had this difficulty. The rule said that every Passionist should drink some red wine a day. Now that might sound extravagant, but it was because they weren't eating anything else. And it was basically for the sake of keeping the blood good and so on. Because Dominic had to write back to Rome and say, hang on, wine is the drink of the aristocrats. We can't afford it. Ale, beer is the drink of the local people. And it was something that was never resolved during Dominic's lifetime, this sort of battle. It was a very severe life. So you've got Ignatius joining from one of the wealthiest families, desperate to get rid of any money. Interestingly, the money from the family continued as a Catholic priest. But once he became a Passionist, the brother who had control of giving the money said, no, that's an end. I'm prepared to support you as a Catholic priest, but not as a begging monk. Oh. And so the money was cut off completely. But to be fair to the brother, he didn't pocket the money. He then used that for charitable purposes. You know, there was this integrity within the family. So it was really quite something. When he got a chance then, he would go off to Europe. But again, it wasn't hit and miss. He was very clever. He'd find out, oh, the bishops of such and such a region are meeting. So he'd make sure he ended up in the town where the bishops were meeting. He'd wheedle his way in. He'd say, may I address the bishops? So he would tell them about the need for supporting with prayers the mission in England. He'd get the bishops to promise, and often he'd get letters of recommendation from them, and then he'd go to the religious provincials or major superiors, and he'd get them to promise to write to their communities. So it's a whole trickle-down thing of trying to get things going. And this, I suppose, is what's at the back of his major apostolic work. It was what he called the Crusade for the Conversion of England. He didn't mean, let's get 100,000 Anglicans and make them Catholic. It was about unity in the faith. And so his big thing was, first of all, he wanted to get permission to pray together with Anglicans. Now, I remember as a child, I wouldn't be allowed to go into an Anglican church. I couldn't go to a funeral of a relative if it was in an Anglican church. Catholics were not allowed, end of. You know, it was as clear as that. So this is 100 years earlier. They're saying, well, can we at least pray with them? And Rome said, absolutely not. So Ignatius said, well, the Catholics can pray, the Anglicans can pray. And this is why originally he went to Oxford to meet with Newman, to ask Newman, will you get your people to pray? And Newman, who knew about Ignatius, refused to meet him. And in his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, you know, it's his autobiography.
Yeah.
He writes an apology saying, this good, gentle man. And he knew what it was about. But Newman was very aware that if he was seen even having a meal with an Anglican convert clergyman of celebrity status, Ignatius, everybody would talk and it would be far more destructive. So he did write to Ignatius. But one of the mysteries, the letter has never been found. And Ignatius, 20 odd years later, writes and says, I never got the letter. You know, so Newman obviously felt it, he was sensitive, but it didn't work out. So there's all sorts of intriguing little mysteries in this. So coming back to his main apostolate, it was to get people, I mean, he worked through France, Italy, Holland, Germany, Belgium, and he preached in Dutch, amazingly. I mean, he was fluent in French and Italian, Latin, he could manage Greek, he was familiar with Hebrew. But he actually, because of the Dutch novices who were joining, he actually almost taught himself how to communicate, using a Dutch translation of the Imitation of Christ. That was one of his main things. So, I mean, he was no simple country parson. I mean, very, very, very bright. I mean, when he was at Cambridge, he was normally the second. He was in the top 3 always in the class. And that wasn't because of who he was. It was his own intellectual ability. I mean, he took his studies seriously. A lot of tea drinking, a lot of card playing, but maybe again, 14 hours a day reading. And remember, this is without electric light. You know, it must have been a huge strain on the eyes at times.
Amazing, yes.
So all the time, he was working his way around Europe, begging people to pray for the conversion of England. Now, he would be quite happy to go down to the workhouse, to the hospice, but equally, he would be expected to get an invite in to meet the emperor. Didn't bat an eyelid. And because of who he was, he normally got in. You know, he'd walk away with 1,000 crowns as a donation. And I've never quite worked out how he got all the money back. But I mean, that was just my own personal intrigue. I've never quite worked out how they shifted money internationally. You know, they didn't have wire services and all of that sort of thing. But anyway, so it was working for unity. That was basically his life. He did nothing else then as a Passionist but that. He was appointed sometimes as a superior. It didn't work out. People actually complained about him being superior because he would just vanish to do his preaching, and he'd leave Father Joseph, the vicar, his assistant, to do it all. And he said, "Oh, Joseph's very good at the job." And you can imagine Joseph saying, "Yeah, but it's not my job; it's your job." You know, so it was quite. But again, this is often in a hostile environment in England when he's preaching. So he was in London on one occasion, and some of the mob, and I use the word use absolutely without a shadow of doubt, a mob saw him leaving a Protestant minister, and they knew who he was. So they went for him, and they nearly killed him. But he managed to get into a shop, and the shopkeeper closed the door and got him out the back door and away. So things like that often happened. It was dangerous. You know, it's not like today where everybody would be so polite. You might fundamentally disagree. So Dominic never, or Ignatius never wrote any great mystical or theological tracts. His argument again and again was, may they all be one. This is the prayer of Jesus. This is what we have to work for. And as I say, he didn't go out to convert everybody. He said, at least if we start not knocking seven bells out of one another, you know, that's a beginning. We need to work together for Christian unity. He makes a number of trips to Rome. Again, if you think of the time. But again, on the way, he might meet people and he'd say, well, are you praying? Are you praying? Are you praying? I mean, we know that eventually he was getting letters from as far away as he calls it, Persia, saying that his crusade had been established in Persia. Yeah, well, part of that was because the British Empire was being developed, apart from in America, obviously. You know, so people were spreading the word. You know, as the Navy went out, as tradesmen went out, as travelers went out, so the message of Ignatius went out. So it was spreading all over the world.
What strikes me is that today, I would suspect, and I'm certainly guilty of this, that most of us, even in this age of ecumenism and where we have, you know, the month of Christian unity and things like this, most of us aren't praying that all may be one. Back then, I imagine that his bringing it up must have been the first time anyone has ever even thought of this.
I would say that he was prophetic in ecumenism. Along with Dominic, they both worked out of the same pot. There are several sections of Vatican II documents that are Ignatius through and through. And you're right, the prayer of octave, as we have it for Christian unity in January, that basically owes its origins to Ignatius and the work he did. The other thing, as an aside, which, yeah, you've got it in the States, you've got the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, yeah?
Right.
Right. We call it the SVP. He encountered some students while he was in Paris, and they'd established a group of the SVP, and he was very, very impressed. So he came back and he wrote an article and had it published in the tablet, and it's a description of the origins and how these men work. And I mean, he's able to record them that when they meet every fortnight, they say, well, we gave out 6 bags of coal and 16 loaves and all of this. And so he's hoping to get it established. And he writes a long time later, only one priest wrote back saying what a brilliant idea the SVP is. I've tried every which way to find out who the priest was, but we know he was in Lancashire, up in northern England, but no. But interestingly, there was a man called Pagliano, and he was a convert. Now, he must have been Italian with a name like Pagliano. And what he did, he had a son, I think, in Oscott. And so Ignatius made friends with him and in effect sold him the idea of the SVP. Pagliano established the first meeting of the SVP in England. And I actually found where it took place. It's just in a little side street off Leicester Square, you know, the centre of the entertainment industry now in England.
Mm.
So the SVP, it's often not associated with the Passionists, but it was because of Ignatius that it was brought to England and then spread all over. Still to this day, I mean, it's doing tremendous work supporting those who are on the edge of society. So that was Ignatius, his thing of care for the poor and prayers for the conversion of England. Let's say he met Pius IX a couple of times and managed to get him to support the work and to give indulgences. If you stand back objectively, he wasn't a good superior. He, as I say, was often away, but he didn't see that was his work, that was his penance. But he took it seriously. So sometimes he would come back maybe late at night. And the tradition was that the Passionists would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning for an hour of prayer. Again, it was an Italian-based thing. It was because it was often too hot to pray in the afternoon in Italy. So it was a lot easier to pray at night. Well, of course, the climate was slightly different in England. But they'd gather, or he'd come back late, and they would sing the Divine Office. Well, one of his regrets, I mentioned about him not learning the guitar, was he regretted not learning music. And so he said sometimes when they sang the office, and there was just two of them, it wasn't very prayerful or tuneful. So it was just him being honest. You know, I've lived in communities like that where, you know, they actually pay you not to sing because you can make such a mess of it. So, yes, an extraordinary man. Coming to the end of his life, he gave a series of missions up in Glasgow, and then he was moving across to Edinburgh, which is due west, and he was going by train, and the train stopped at a place called Carstairs Junction, and he knew it would be there for an hour and a quarter, and just up the lane, literally 10-minute walk, is Carstairs House, and that's where his godson lived. So he decided he would spend the time, go up and say hello and spend a bit of time with the godson. As he was walking up, he met a little girl and had a little chat with her, and then walked up and he suffered a massive seizure. So much so that when eventually the godson came down and looked, he didn't recognize him. He was so disfigured. And it was only when they went through his pockets that they found the letter and he realized who he was. So the body was then taken back to Sutton, St. Helens, and he was buried beside Dominic Barbary and Mother Mary Joseph Prout. So it was an extraordinary story. But several people wrote after he had died, he had said to them, one of his prayers in life was that, like his master, he would die alone and abandoned in a ditch. So he got his prayer.
What?
So at the moment, we're waiting for him to be declared venerable. That's the first stage towards beatification. Then we need a miracle, and he's blessed, and then we need another miracle. It's been suggested that the first miracle should be that I didn't go blind reading his diary. We're not sure that Rome would accept that, though. So there.
What is it that he teaches us today about holiness? I mean, there's this perseverance for the sake of Christ, and the fact that he was willing to exhaust himself on his vocation.
It's about unity.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We're the brothers and sisters of Jesus.
Okay.
It's as basic as that. It's living the commandment of love. And he saw the big saw in the church. was this big rip, this wound caused by the Reformation, as he saw it. And so we need to go back to Christian unity.
Right. As Pope Benedict put it, it's a scandal to unbelievers that we aren't unified. Yeah. How can we be a witness to the Muslims, the Hindus, the Taoists, the Zoroastrians, whoever, if there are, depending on what count you put your stake in, 10 to 40,000 sects around the world? And go ahead. Sorry.
Now, there's a story that an Englishman went to Texas and he was being driven around Houston and he was impressed by all the churches. And he says to the taxi man, "Boy, you folk in Texas sure love God." And the driver said, "Yeah, but they sure as hell hate one another."
Well, there's something to that.
And apologies to all Texans viewing in. I'm sure you love God.
Well, yes. I was about to say, even though they love a baseball team that cheats its way to the top, but we don't want to get into controversial topics here. The fascinating fact is that he is a model for us in this respect even today. There's ecumenism done wrong, where, okay, it's great, we'll just all believe there's no one perfect way to God. Ignatius was very, very committed to the idea that there's one truth. You can't have multiple truths. Ultimately, you can have a hierarchy of truths. Some things are more true than others, but ultimately there is one truth, and that truth is objective. It's not, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Yeah. And so his ecumenism, his prayer for unity, that all may be one, is really a beautiful witness to us today, and really the way that ecumenism should be conducted, because we're all, Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm not a way, a truth, and the life, And the Holy Spirit will lead you into all truth and all the rest." So it is a beautiful example for us today. One question I have is, John Henry Newman is, by one account, responsible for 40,000 conversions into the Catholic Church. Now, whether that's accurate or not, I don't know how one can really know, but that was the figure I read at one point. Ignatius, I know you said that his effort was not to bring 100,000 Anglicans into Holy Mother Church, but was he responsible for any conversions that were notable or that we know of?
On all of them missions, all the Passionists would keep a journal of how many conversions they made. Even starting with Dominic, on his first mission, he made 8. And if you think that they didn't understand a word he said, it's quite impressive. They would make 30, 40. But sometimes what you've got to think, Brian, is when they're saying conversion, often it could be people who had fallen away from the practice of their faith and they had come back. So a classic is when you get a lot of refugees, they leave the home country where they practice their faith. And because they're trying to establish themselves, they often don't get involved in the church that they've moved to. And so they fall away. And then something happens, maybe a mission. That's when they come back. So that could often be classed as a conversion. Newman, of course, was a leading academic. I have no idea how anybody works out 40,000. You could put it down to the whole thing about the Irish coming into the country and the growth of the church. But I would be uneasy sort of agreeing that it was 40,000. You can't tell. Even a number of his own colleagues who became Catholic, 1 or 2 left and went back to Anglicanism. So Newman is, I think, I'm not against him. Don't get me wrong. You know, I mean, who am I? The church says he's a saint, but Newman isn't what I find an easy person. I find him at times quite distant. I've tried to finish 3 biographies of him, and I've never succeeded. Some people, I think a lot of it is cultural.
Okay.
A lot of his stuff is very intellectual. It just, whereas Ignatius, you know, he would have no problem. As I say, he could deal with the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. I think Newman would have had problems with the poor, the really poor. Now he did. He gave great support to the poor in Birmingham. Great support. But the 40,000, I don't know how anybody would arrive at a figure like that. And given that people like Dominic and Ignatius were in some ways better established than Newman, and I've never heard any claims even remotely close to that for these men. If they're talking about a whole movement in the church, yes, the church in England grew, but it was following Catholic emancipation and heavily supported by 2 strands. A, the Irish potato famine, causing the Irish to come in with their faith, and B, the arrival of the Italian religious orders, Passionists, Redemptorists, Rosminians. And these established A, the missions, so that enabled a lot of reconciliation, and B, they built a lot of churches and educational centres. So yeah, that to me would make more of a rounded view. Yeah.
Yeah, and not maybe they're crediting Newman's conversion with the growth in the church after his conversion. Yeah. And certainly his writings, you know, for instance, Marcus Grodi of EWTN and the Coming Home Network and whatnot, he credits Newman very, very heavily with his own conversion, his own coming into the Catholic Church.
No doubt.
So, you know, I mean, exactly that he would have had that kind of impact. But it sounds to me as though while there were no big flashbangs in terms of conversions for Ignatius, he nonetheless had a converting presence and an impact on the lives of so many people.
In Ireland, there was a man called Father Matthew, and he was really, I'm not sure the full history of this, but he'd be closely associated with what today we would call the Pioneer Association, or the Total Abstinence Association. You got that in the States?
No, I'm not familiar with it at all.
They basically promise not to take alcohol.
But so that's in our history, that's the temperance movement.
Yeah, well, that is precisely what it comes out of, the temperance movement. And Ignatius was due to preach in Manchester, and Father Matthew was to preach there before on temperance. And Ignatius says 80,000 people came to hear Father Matthew preach. And he said, and this is when they know he wants to take away the one comfort that they have in their life. That they're all drinking gin. They were desperate, absolute poverty. And Ignatius is envious because he says, if only we could get such enthusiasm, 80,000 working for the conversion of England. So there's a whole thing there in terms of how they would preach. But I mean, the very way of, if you think, how do you preach to 80,000 people? No tannoy system, no sound amplification. So they put guys halfway down, or a quarter of the way down, halfway down, 3/4 of the way down. They'd listen, they'd shout back what had just been said, they'd shout it back further, and that's how they communicated. I often wondered how much miscommunication took place. I guess you'd have somebody at the back saying, that's fake news. I'm not being political.
No, it's probably, you know, there's, what does Solomon write? There's nothing new under the sun. So that's true. A good example of it. Father, thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning and giving us this great insights into a truly remarkable man. Would you do us a favor and give us your blessing, please?
And may the love of God be ever in your hearts and in your minds. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father. And thank you, folks, for joining us today on That Catholic Saints Guy. By all means, if you've liked what you see and you want to see more, hit that little subscribe button right down there. Give us the thumbs up, share. And if you have any questions or ideas for a future episode, by all means, let us know in the comment section and we'll go from there. In the meantime, may God bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.